Hello, everyone. I would like to welcome everybody in the room and those of you online to the first of our two-part event where we are going to discuss disability and architecture from an ADA professional perspective. The second event will be held Wednesday, April 20th from 1 o'clock to 2:30 right here. And next time we'll be talking to students about their perspective and experiences with ADA and accessibility. So now, with great pleasure, I get to introduce to you two of our student rock stars, Leo and Mia, with the American Institute of Architecture Students Club.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us for this collaborative effort between the DAC, the Disability Awareness Club, the AIAS, the American Institute of Architecture students, the Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Compliance, and the Office of Disability Services and Accessibility. My name is Mia, and I am a co-leader from the AIAS at JJC, and I will be one of the moderators for today.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Leo. I'm also one of the co-leaders of the AIAS at JJC. I just wanted to begin with an origin of how this event started. Esley, if you can please stand up for me. Thank you. So, thank you, Esley. This event started when Esley approached me at Main Street at JJC, and she chit-chatted me about how designs of buildings affect people with disabilities, and we wanted to create an awareness of how we can bring this attention to people so they can understand more about ADA, but also the importance of people with disabilities and how it can improve JJC. The purpose of this event is to highlight the importance of considering accessibility and ADA when considering physical space and architecture.
Before we get started on the presentation portion of this event, we please ask everyone to answer some questions in a poll.
For the people who are virtual, we provide a poll to fill out, and for those who are in the audience, we will ask you to put a thumbs up, a thumbs in the middle, and thumbs down based on the questions. So for the first question, how familiar are you with the terms disability and accessibility? Good, that's good. For those who are in virtual and cannot see the questions, they can be found in the chat. All right, so for the second question, how familiar are you with American Disability Act, the ADA? Okay, that's good, very nice. And for the last question, how familiar are you with the application of ADA in architecture? Okay, so with that question, I hope that we can help better understand, give you a better understanding and insight to architecture and ADA. And thank you for answering those questions. Now we would like to introduce our speakers for today. We'll read a short bio of them, but if you'd like more information, please go to the link on the screen. Thank you.
Representing disability awareness, we have Adam Woke and Dr. Tracy Morris. Adam Woke is the manager of disability services here at JJC. He has worked in education for over 15 years. He started his career as a high school teacher and guidance counselor. Then his passion for working with students with disabilities has led him to work his way up to his current position.
Dr. Tracy Morris is our compliance officer at JJC since 2018. She earned her master's in counseling and doctorates in an adult higher education from Northern Illinois University. She has nearly 28 years of educational related experience, and she currently oversees institutional compliance across a variety of areas, including ADA compliance.
Representing ADA law is Lorianne Shainstead. She earned her bachelor's degree in history and certificate in business management from Indiana University and earned her JD and certificate in international and comparative law from IIT Chicago Kent College of Law. She currently works at the law firm RCK, focusing on public and private business concerns, and has several years of working experience in the field of law.
Lastly, representing ADA and architecture, we have Adam Quigley and Sylvia Kowak. Adam Quigley is a member of the AIA, works at Liga Architects and has more than 20 years of experience in architectural planning and design. He holds a Master of Architecture degree from the University of Michigan and an undergraduate degree in architecture from the University of Illinois at Chicago. He works on everything from replacing inefficient systems to tweaking environments for employee recruitment.
Sylvia Kowak is an associate member of the AIA and is a leader of Leggett Architects' interior design practice since 2011. She earned a Bachelor of Arts in Interior Design from the Visual Design Institute in Mexico. Her focus is designing visually engaging interior environments that elevate mood and improve efficiency. So to get us started, first up on the floor, we have Adam Woke and Dr. Tracy Morris speaking about understanding disability. We will have a short question and answer after their presentation, so for those in the audience, just hold your questions to the end, and for those in the virtual audience, the chat will be open for you to post questions there.
Thank you so much. As I said, my name is Adam Woke. I'm the manager of the Disability Services office here, and I'm going to be presenting here with Tracy. And Tracy, you just jump in whenever you feel like I'm messing something up, so that shouldn't be too often. That should be actually very often. I believe there's some slides as well. I don't know if we can jump ahead to those. We can go one more. Great. I wanted to start with this slide because I think it's really important in understanding the perspective of individuals with disabilities as they enter higher ed. Because the reality is they go through a major change in the law that provides them the accessibility that they're seeking. In the K through 12 environment, students with disabilities function under what's called IDEA law. And that's the law that helps provide the accommodations that students use in the school setting. That law is written as a law of success. And what that means is that it's the institution, the schools themselves that are responsible for making sure that individuals with disabilities are given their accommodations and are doing everything they can to ensure that students are successful. When an individual turns the age of 18 and comes to the higher ed setting, they no longer function under the IDEA law, but now are under the American Disabilities Act. And in the higher ed setting, when it comes to academics, that law is a law of access. So it is incumbent upon the higher ed institution and offices like ours to make sure that students with disabilities have accommodations that gain them access to the class. Which means whether a student fails or not by law, we're just going the bare minimum of law, it's not the higher ed institution's requirement to make sure that they are successful. And that change in the perspective of the law also really changes the way students engage with their accommodations. In the K through 12 setting, it is the teacher's responsibility to make sure that all accommodations and things are set up for the students. So for example, when I used to teach in high school, I would get a stack of papers at the beginning of the year with every student's accommodation. And it was my responsibility to make sure that those students received that. Well, when students come to college, they have to identify with the college and register with our office. At that time, we come up with the accommodations based on documentation and an interview. And then the student is given a form that states what all of their accommodations are. And it's the student's responsibility to deliver that to each one of their teachers. It goes even further than that. When we get into the actual accommodation itself, it's the student's responsibility in college to make sure that they get extra time on every single test if that's their accommodation. Or if they have a note taker, that they work with the instructor to set it up. The student has far more responsibility in making sure that their accommodations are set up when they get to college. And this is a big transition. I focus on this because it's asking a lot of students over just a 3-month period. You graduate in May, in August you're in school, and you are suddenly far more involved in ensuring that you have your accommodations, your ADA rights. You go from if you had an IEP for all 12 years of your K through 12 school, the school has done that for you. They set up the meetings, they set all that stuff up, and now overnight. That responsibility falls on the student, and that could be overwhelming. It can be really difficult transition. And so I think that's important to recognize as we start to talk about beyond just the classroom, and we're looking at how ADA functions in the lives of individuals with disabilities under ADA. I think we have to also recognize the transition that 18, 19, 20-year-olds are going through and understanding this new law. What does it mean to me? What does that mean to me every day? What's my role? What's my responsibility? That's a lot, and to educate our students on that is a big part of what our office tries to do in our partnerships with our high schools. Do you want to comment any more on the law?
I just think that very often in my role as the compliance officer, I'm here to support students who might not feel like their accommodations are being met. So we are required by law and very glad to have my role as the ADA and Section 504 coordinator. So if a student doesn't feel as if their accommodations are being met, they have the ability to go to Adam, and if that doesn't work, then they come to me. And the process is set that way for a reason, so that we can provide support for our students and provide them opportunity to ask questions. A lot of what we see is helping students to understand the difference between the two laws. So Adam and his team have really changed and do a really good job of explaining that to students more on the front end than maybe we did a few years ago. So we're all here with the ultimate goal of supporting our students. And that's kind of the only thing I wanted to say.
Yeah, and I just want to add to that because I think this is going to be fluid throughout a lot of our conversation, is that ADA law is not black and white. It is very much not black and white, and it is evolving and it is changing. The Office of Civil Rights and the Department of Justice are hearing cases all the time that individuals bring up and say that this was something that was not accessible. This should be under ADA law, and it isn't. And there are times where we get really great rulings from the DOJ and the Office of Civil Rights that really help guide us to make sure that what we're doing in practice meets not just the law, because it's important to go above and beyond that, but to make sure at the very least we're doing that. And there are times and there are requests that there isn't a ruling. There isn't always a very clear line of what that is. And so it's really great having an office like Tracy's, because we might make a decision in our office based on everything that's in front of us, but I won't say that every decision we make is perfect and great, and it should be looked at by another office, because we need to work through these things together. And I think that's important in starting to understand this law, especially as we're going to apply it much broader than just the academic environment. Because I think at the end of the day, this image here is really important. This is one that you're going to see at DEI conferences. You're going to see this image at disability conferences. It's this idea of what we should be striving for as an institution. And the bottom right, where it says inclusion, is really what, and everything that I do in my work, we are striving for. We are striving for inclusion. We recognize that the students in front of us are neurodiverse, regardless of disability, and making sure we're creating an environment, no matter where you're at in your IQ, in your ability, in your strengths, and in your weaknesses, you feel welcomed in this community. And it's a huge undertaking. It's a huge undertaking to get there, but one that our office really enjoys taking on. A couple of other things here. So some things when we're just thinking about some of the academic things that ADA does require. We do have some very black and white judgments from the Department of Justice and Office of Civil Rights that do require a level of accommodations that we do need to be granting students. And that's from extra time on tests or assignments, occasional absences, students who need to make sure we have tables that are accessible in a classroom if you have a wheelchair, captioning videos, an interpreter like we have here today. Really important for a lot of students with particular disabilities. And it's important that our office make sure that we follow everything that the ADA does require of us to instill. And that same thing goes for what we're going to talk about today when it comes to architecture. There are things that we have to make sure of. You know, just a small example, and we're going to go deeper into this, but you know, just having access of getting into the building, those buttons that I know we've all used from time to time, even those who might not have a disability, but we got 8 bags in each hand and we hit it with our elbow to get in. Like, that's a perfect example of actually just good design, because it helps an individual who might be in a wheelchair not open that door, but also it helps other people who might have a variety of things in between. Right. And so there are ADA requirements in the classroom, but there's also ADA goes well beyond education. ADA is a much bigger umbrella than just education and does talk about those physical spaces that we'll dig deeper into as we move along. Going beyond ADA, which I think is an extremely important conversation, one that I'm really looking to hear from my colleagues as well, because to me, in my humble opinion, is that the bare minimum of ADA law is not nearly enough for individuals with disabilities. We still, I think, very much fall short in helping and supporting this community. When we look at poverty rates and unemployment rates, they are higher among individuals with disabilities than any other group. And to me, that screams social justice, which means we have to do more than just the law. We have to think about coaching, and our office does that. We provide week-to-week coaching for individuals, so they can come and meet with us for 30 minutes at a time. We're creating courses to help bring up pass and failure rates in developmental math, where we can see that up to some semesters, 60% of individuals with disabilities are failing math. That's not something that I think our office can sit comfortably with. And while ADA law doesn't require us to do that, you can't work in this office if you're just trying to meet the law. You have to meet the people where they're at, the students that are in front of you, and helping do that. And so other things, and it's something I think I'm just going to point to on here as well, is universal design. Universal design is a pedagogy that I use a lot when I'm working with teachers, and it's basically, very short ways, it's creating diversified content for individuals to access. So, for example, if you're learning about Freud's iceberg theory in psychology, that you're not just given a one-page handout on how to learn it, but also here is a audio transcription of a presentation of someone explaining it. Here's another reading that you can take a look at. Here's a teacher who's going to explain it. Having multiple explanations of a single piece of content is a really great way to universally design your course to meet everybody. But universal design also speaks a lot to architecture as well, in the way that we think about buildings and how they're set up and how they're shaped, from sound to color to size. These are things in thinking about all people who enter a physical space.
Adam, if I can just jump in real
Please
quick,
do.
from the first slide, when we talk about accommodations, very important to realize that those are individualized. Even two people who have the same diagnosis will have different accommodations based on their needs. So that is a very interactive one-to-one process. The second slide really is that going above is something we are doing for everyone, with the intention of serving everyone, regardless of which type of disability or which type of learning style. Really kind of that extra added bonus to what we do. And when we start talking about architecture, you're going to see similar things. There are things that we're required to do and things that we do as best practice in that universal design. So it all kind of ties together.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. And as I said, to me, this is very much a social justice issue. You have 26% of adults who have some disability. And also, I think very interesting when we look at any, group, this is the only group that anyone can fall into. When we think about race, religion, ethnicity, this is actually one any of us could fall into at any time. We have 1 in 3 adults with unmet healthcare needs in the disability community. That's a crazy number, because you're talking about a group of people that do have healthcare needs, and to know that 33% of them aren't getting that, that's huge. And as I said, 25% live in poverty, which is the highest among any group. So this is very much something I think that's important to all of us as community members.
Thank you, Adam and Dr. Morris, for that very insightful information. Very informative too. Honestly, the last slide was very, very touching, because everyone it's for everyone, no matter what age, no matter what race, it can happen. So it's very necessary to be accounted for. And so we will now take a few minutes and extend the conversation to everyone in the audience. If you'd like to ask Adam or Dr. Morris a question, feel free. We will also check the chat for questions as well. Thank you.
Yes.
How many students at Joliet Junior College use the disability services?
So we serve roughly around 1,200 students. And of the 1,200 students that we serve, the largest cohorts, largest group with disabilities is learning disabilities and those with a mental health diagnosis. And I'm projecting that by the end of fall, the largest group we'll serve will be those with mental health diagnosis. The second fastest growing group of individuals with disabilities that we serve are those on the spectrum. We're seeing those rates greatly increase. And, I think that has more to do with the improvements we've made in the identification process of those on the spectrum at an earlier age, which has really helped provide those students with the services that they need younger.
And I think to add to that, that's only the students who have come forward to
Yeah.
request services, because unlike high school, the student has to make initial contact. So it's our assumption that the numbers are much higher. So as we do education, we really want people to know that they're welcome and that they're accepted and that we are here to help. And the more we do that, I think our numbers will continue to grow as well.
And a follow-up question, how many of our faculty and staff are employees? Because I know your office may not deal with that, but your office might have to.
Actually, that usually goes through human resources. I can serve and assist if there's needs with an appeal. I have not had to do that at this point, but that really is held through HR. And I don't even know that I know the numbers on that.
Yeah, I don't. Our office only focuses in on students, but if they want to give me a raise, I'd look into it.
Hi, Adam. Thank you for your presentation. You had mentioned that one of the services you provide for students is coaching. Can you kind of tell us a little bit more about that, what the coaching looks like?
Absolutely. I talked about the transition, right? About those with disabilities, how the law changes. And so the way they use their accommodations is different. But also, too, the classroom is just a different place, regardless of disability. For those of you students in this room, like you went from being in class 5 days a week, 45 minutes at the time in the same class, Monday through Friday, August through May. Then you come to college, you're in front of your teacher maybe 2 times a week, maybe 3. From August to December, you're in class far less. You're given way more homework, things to read, things to write. It's really a huge shift in the way all students interact with their education. And so what our office does is we'll meet with any student once a week for anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour to really look at what I call the metacognition. We look at like metacognitive skills, so note-taking, study skills, organization, time management, the way we use our memory. We employ a variety of different techniques that stem from universal design to mind-brain education to kind of really change the way students interact with their work, but also just to plan their week. So if you sit down and be like, I've got all these things I've got to do, I've got all these syllabi, I don't know what to do here and when, we're going to sit down with you and help you really plan out your day and time. But beyond that too, the reality is like I said, the second largest group we serve are those who have a mental health diagnosis and those who may have an anxiety, depression, or anything like that. We also work to kind of help students maintain a healthy view of themselves, to help them stay confident, to help them deal with a panic attack that they may have had from a class, right? Or anxiety they might be feeling about a test that they've got coming up. We're also working with students to help them manage those emotions in the moment. We may not be doing therapy, but if you got a test in 2 hours and you're having a panic attack, we want to meet you and help you with what we can. So it's really, I kind of were like the geek squad for individuals with disabilities, like bring us whatever your obstacle is. We will never turn you away. Even if we don't have the answer, we're going to find someone who does, because we recognize how difficult that transition can be. Thank you. More questions, please. I'd be happy to answer anything that might be on your mind.
I think they'll come up with some after the architecture.
We've got one more here.
Adam, you mentioned that in high school, the services are there and everything's pretty much done for the students. And that high school to college transition, we lose students because they don't come forward and let us know. So what are we doing here at JJC to help reduce the number of students that we lose in the transition from high school to college?
So one of the big things that I've always been big on in any disability office that I've worked on, and the thing that I actually really enjoy about being in a community college specifically, is the partnerships that we can have with our high schools. We have to get to them earlier, and we have to get to the parents earlier. We need to talk to them when they're freshmen in high school. We have to talk to those students. So I've spent a lot of time growing those relationships. We're currently piloting a transition program at Bolingbrook and Lincoln Way High Schools. I go there once a month and deliver a lesson plan on a variety of transitional issues, and we've been doing it since August. So whether it's taking on the independence of budgeting my life and what that means all the way to identifying with the disability. We really try to do a lot to get students prepared for that transition far earlier, and the parents as well. We do trainings for the social workers and teachers in our high school districts as well, because those who are in the trenches are those who have the ability to affect those students' perspective on these things, right? And so that's the biggest thing that we're trying to do, is trying to get that as early as possible. And then, the more we can do with our teachers and staff and training and let people know, hey, we're here to help, we're here to partner, we don't silo ourselves off. I want every staff member at JJC, I want every teacher to know who we are and what we do and how we do it, because there are going to be students that slip through, and we need others to be able to help say, hey, you know what? There's this office over here that can help you. So the awareness parts is one of the biggest parts.
Do have a few questions online. Christina asks, Adam, how does the IDEA K through 12 and ADA affect students who start at JJC when they're still 17 years old?
So students that do any dual credit type programs or taking college level classes, ADA law applies to them. So if you could be a junior in high school taking a dual credit English class, you actually will have to go by the accommodations set up by ADA, not the high school. Considering that the class is college level, we have to make sure that those laws apply. So that's a really great question for those students that do go through that. Talk about another adjustment. Now I'm a junior in high school and I've got these two laws that I'm balancing. It could be a real balancing act for sure.
We have one more from Karen. Is there documentation needed for a JJC student to receive services from Disability Services?
By law, technically we don't have to have documentation, but in order for that to be the case, we have to have evidence that we can visibly see, that we can say, here is the disability. As I'm sure you would all imagine, there are times where that might be easier than others, and most times that is not something that we are able to do in a single session with an individual. So in those cases, we require documentation of the diagnosis so that we can make sure we meet it. Most cases, the vast majority of them, we're going to need to require documentation, and that comes in the form of an IEP or 504. That's an individualized education plan that is created in the K through 12 system to provide those accommodations. We can provide a letter from any medical professional on letterhead typed. We usually ask for like the license number of the individual and contact information. And then we have a form here that students can give to their medical professionals as well to fill out.
I think the really important thing is the emphasis is less on the words on that documentation and more about that interactive process. So yes, you may have a piece of paper which we need to help and assist, but really the team does a great job of working one-to-one. What is it that you need? What is it where you're limited, and how can we help provide equal access? And so that one-to-one conversation, I know sometimes people are like, oh, do I really have to come to another meeting? That is one of the most valuable sessions you will ever have in your time at JJC. I'm pretty confident in saying, not that all the other ones aren't very, very important, but that interactive process is the key. It's the magic key to the kingdom, so to speak. So every step, it seems like a lot of steps, but each is very intentional to provide students with what they need to be successful.
Great.
All right, thank you so much for those questions. We will now be moving on. We have Lorian Shainstead to tell us about ADA law. Same as before, there'll be a short question and answer at the end.
Hello, I'm Lorian Shainstead. I'm one of the college's attorneys, and I'm going to be talking just kind of broadly about ADA law because, as Adam said, it's constantly ebbing and flowing. There's a lot of updates that come about both under Illinois law, across the country, and worldwide. And so we're always monitoring trends for what can be a reasonable accommodation and to how to help make sure that everyone is given equal access both in the workplace and in education. So looking at just broadly, a couple important definitions under the ADA. Disability is defined as an impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity, a record of such impairment, or being regarded as having such an impairment. And a major life activity includes seeing, hearing, learning, lifting, communicating, working, as well as major bodily functions such as functions of the immune system, neurological, brain, circulatory, digestive, and also reproductive functions. And this is not a specific list, it's very broad, and it constantly fluctuates as we kind of move, especially understanding more mental health issues going forward in society today. And the ADA covers a variety of entities, employers, educational institutions, as well as public places of accommodation, such as when you go to vote, for example, going into any public building or a city hall. And the first title of the ADA covers employers with 15 or more employees, and this includes state and local governments as well. And it prohibits employers from discriminating against qualified individuals with disabilities. And then Title II applies to state and local government entities, as well as entities that are receiving public funds, such as public community colleges or universities. And Title III also applies to places of public accommodations, and this includes schools, colleges, universities, libraries, city halls, various places like that, movie theaters, restaurants. And this requires the educational institution to make certain educational opportunities, extracurricular activities, and facilities open and accessible to all students. And looking at the various purposes and guidelines, it's important to ensure that those who have various specified disabilities are allowed equal accommodated access to both employment and education. And the ADA applies in all areas of employment, public accommodations, transportation, buses, railways, going on a plane, and also education, and then services offered by governmental entities. And one aim of the Americans with Disabilities Act is to make educational institutions more accessible to disabled individuals by providing reasonable accommodations. And previously, in a couple slides ago, I know that we talked about education, public accommodations, or accommodations in education. And so I'm just going to look briefly at various accommodations in the public and then also in the workplace as well. So a couple of these include installing accessible doorknobs and hardware, installing grab bars in bathrooms, creating handicap parking spaces, installing various ramps inside and outside, having curb cuts, sidewalks, and entrances that are accessible, widening door openings for wheelchair access, and also importantly, maintaining and updating those accommodations. So an employer or a school can't create this accommodation and then in 10 or 20 years, not continue to update that. That's also very important in order to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act. And now turning to employer accommodations, this can include acquiring or changing equipment or devices, making existing facilities more readily accessible, modifying or using alternative work schedules, hearing and visual impairment technology, telecommuting, and also modifying restrooms as well. And there's a couple exceptions to this. Sometimes you might hear the term undue hardship, and this can include if there's a significant financial hardship or if there's an operational hardship, such as it creates disruption or is overly loud or things like that. And that's very hard to kind of specify certain nuances. Again, that's very case-by-case basis, and we are constantly monitoring cases that follow in the courts. That way we can ensure compliance. So there's a lot of pretty significant repercussions for non-compliance under the ADA. There is a $75,000 fine for a first violation against a business or organization that the Department of Justice can hand down. And after that, any subsequent violation is $150,000. And that's just assessed against the organization or entity. There can also be lawsuits that individuals or groups of individuals with disabilities can file against that organization or entity as well. And this can include a variety of civil penalties, including punitive damages, depending on how severe the violation is. And then it also can create damage to the reputation within the community, because the goal of the ADA is to ensure that we are not discriminating against individuals, and everyone has an equal opportunity and access to education, to employment, and to also public accommodations. And then lastly, just looking at the continued importance of the ADA in our society, we all want to make sure that we provide a level playing field and equal access to employment and education. And we want to continue prohibiting discrimination and assessing fines and various penalties for discrimination, whether that has to do with the ADA or with various other violations with the EEOC or the Illinois Department of Human Rights as well. And again, as I mentioned previously, there are a variety of repercussions for noncompliance. And if you feel that you have been discriminated against under the ADA, then the appropriate organization would be to contact the Department of Justice. That is the process for filing a complaint in that regard. So that's what I have, if anyone has any questions.
Thank you. My question is about the fines. So when you are found in non-compliance, are you fined or are you given the opportunity to come into compliance?
Potentially both. There's also the due process as well, where if you are found in compliance, there is typically a hearing that can incur. And so it really kind of depends on the situation, but they usually don't just send you the fine. Depending on the severity and what the actual nuance is, there might be a 30-day cure period or things like that.
And do we have any questions in the chat? No? All right. So moving on, we would lastly like to welcome our final speakers today, Adam Quigley and Sylvia Kowak, speaking about how disability comes together with ADA and architecture.
Great. Thanks a lot. I'm Adam Quigley with Leggett Architects. Leggett Architects has done a number of buildings across this campus, including this building. Sylvia, if you want to introduce
Hi, I'm
yourself.
Sylvia. So we'll talk together.
We'll tag team here on this presentation. Let's see. Well, how does ADA affect building design? Well, the ADA was signed into law in 1990. So any buildings that are built after 1990 are required to meet the requirements of the ADA. And those requirements are very broad. So they really affect any way that you're interacting with a building, okay? So I'll give you like a couple of examples. So there could be small things like doors, I think we talked about a little bit. Faucets in bathrooms, water fountains, how those are located and the heights of those. Electrical outlets, the height of electrical outlets are mandated by ADA. Light switches, etc. Right? There's also big things like elevators. So any building that has 2 floors is required to have an elevator. Toilet rooms are very much, there's a lot of rules associated with how the design of toilet rooms is done. Stairways, ramps, and also life safety, right? So if you can look around this room, there are fire alarm devices, for example, these red boxes on the walls. And one of the things that the ADA does is to make sure that there's both an audible and a visual identification when an alarm goes off, right? So let's see. We talked a lot about the ADA standards, or the Americans with Disabilities Act, and that's a federal law. Again, that was signed into law in 1990. In addition to that, buildings and architecture in Illinois specifically also are required to meet the Illinois Accessibility Code, which is developed down in Springfield. And there's a third code as well that many municipalities adopt, which is developed by a private organization called ANSI. ANSI develops standards for a number of things, including accessibility. So as an architect, you need to be able to look at all three of these requirements and make sure that you're meeting the most restrictive of those requirements in for any particular component, right, of a building. And we can look at a couple of different examples as we move through. So, you know, one of the big things that ADA talks about is stairways, right, and what vertical circulation looks like. So that includes the height and configuration of handrails. If you'll notice, a lot of times handrails kind of come down and then go flat for a little bit. That's ADA. They're telling us to do that. There's also a number of landings on stairways typically, and that's ADA as well. You can only rise so many feet until you are required to provide a landing. And in addition to that, there's also elevators, right? So not everybody can use a stairway, and so you need to have an elevator.
Yeah.
And
as you know, as an interior designer, one of the goals is to create an environment that feels nice and welcoming to everybody. So as Alan was talking about, you know, there can be an elevator that is kind of like in the back of the space and nobody knows where it is. But for example, in this example, the elevator is highlighted next to the stairs. So everybody gets the same environment and the same feeling and the same welcoming when you get into the space. So it's how you combine the law, the requirements, but how do you embrace them and make them better in order for everybody, as the other Adam was talking about that universal design.
right. And to that point, we can kind of look at the next example here. It's a little bit hard to see, but you know, you always want to kind of co-locate accessible features with features that might not be accessible. You know, so we have a stair here, for example. It's got a short rise. But behind that stair, there's also a ramp that's kind of integrated into that stairway. So the person that has to use that ramp doesn't necessarily have to go along a different pathway than those folks that are using the stairs.
And ADA is not just accessibility in corridors and stairways, it touches everything. For example, classrooms. In here, we're showing a science, the height of the casework, the way, and we can keep going, the way the furniture is put in a space, everything has to conform to this law and have give opportunity for everybody to participate in the learning and be equitable and there's integration within each environment. And for example, in here, it's not just about the furniture, it's about how you actually walk or transfer yourself, even if you're in a wheelchair or if you're walking around, if you have any kind of disability, how do you walk on the space and what's the openings around the space to give you the same opportunity?
Right, and this is just an example of some of the features that we talked about as well. So, you know, water fountains at different heights. You know, one of the things that I didn't mention was signage, right? So accessible signage is something that's also mandated by the Americans with Disabilities Act. And if you go and look around at any signage, in particular in this building, you'll see that a couple of different features, okay? One is the graphic, okay? So they're required to have a graphic of some kind, especially for a toilet room. The text is required to be at a certain height and have raised letters. And there's also a requirement for contrast between the letters and the background, right? So if you look at this sign in the image or any of the signs as you walk around campus, you'll notice that either the background is going to be very light and the letters are going to be very dark, or you know, the opposite, right? And in addition to that, there's also Braille that's required on any signage within a public facility or private facility for that matter. And in particular, this door has an operator, we talked a little bit of, Adam talked a little bit about operators at the main entrance, but this is a toilet room that that has an operator as well. And that may be because this was an existing facility potentially that didn't meet the clear space requirements around the door, right? So if you're coming up to a door in a wheelchair, there's a certain amount of space that's required on what we call the latch side, so the side that has the handle. And if you can't meet that requirement, that maneuvering requirement, then this would be an option in order to meet that that standard, which is to have an operator, so mechanical, electric way that opens the door.
So guidelines go from, you know, a small bathroom to large auditoriums, literally everywhere. It's not a separation between architecture and ADA. Everything is it's together. And for example, in here, you will see some of the spaces that are missing some of the chairs, and that's giving space for wheelchairs to come in. But it can be also one of the chairs that has a lift on the arm so somebody can transfer. So there are different ways of meeting the same requirements.
Right. And, you know, the goal is always to give the same experience to somebody with a disability as somebody that doesn't, right? So it's not, so the, you know, you always want to kind of distribute those spaces throughout like an auditorium. You're not going to like have all the folks that are participating via wheelchair in one corral, right? They want to be located throughout the space.
During planning, it's important to always have it in the back of your head, especially if you're going to architecture or you're going into interior design. It always has to be in behind your head. So as you can see here, even when you're planning just furniture, we need to plan the right pathways. We need to plan the right amount of access areas for everybody in the building.
So how do we assess older buildings? This is a kind of complicated question, I think, and I don't want to get into it in too much depth, but the minimum requirements for accessibility are less than they are for buildings that were built after 1990. So I'm trying to figure out exactly how to address this question, but so what it really means is that, or the requirement is really around access and life safety, okay? So for example, if you have, one of the requirements is that you have access to a toilet room on any particular floor, okay? So if you had 5 toilet rooms that are on the second floor, at least one of those is going to be required to be accessible. And a lot of it has to do with the hardship required to make that particular facility accessible. But requirements for access and life safety are paramount. So what level of difficulty does it take to integrate and design features that everyone can use when it comes to creativity and universal design? So the short answer to this question is sometimes it's hard and sometimes it's easy, right? But as architects, our job is to really collect all the criteria that's required to design any particular space. And one of those criteria is accessibility requirements, right? But if we're building a space like this one, for example, there's going to be other criteria too. Things like acoustics, right, that are addressed with these panels. You know, the size of the space is determined by the number of people that you want to serve within the room. You know, flexibility. Do we want one big room like we're here, we see here, or do we want it divided into smaller rooms? And you know, it's our job to take all of those ingredients and bake a cake that's functional, right? That space is functional for the needs that it has, and one of those needs is accessibility. And hopefully, what we can do is to take all of those different components and come up with a solution that's more than the sum of its parts. And you may be familiar with this project on the JGC campus. This had a requirement for that there be a transition between two separate buildings. It was a link, and there was a change in elevation, right? So accessibility was paramount in this particular case. And because of that constraint, or that constraint really became an opportunity to define the space around that that transition, right? Which is this kind of ramp that meanders throughout the space. So, sometimes you can take constraints and make them into positives.
And there was a question that was sent to us is, how do you create an environment that will suit everyone? You can't. So tell you the truth. What it is disability is not just about movement. You have disabilities, you have visual disabilities, you have hearing disabilities, you have mental disabilities, you have behavioral problems. So the idea is to try to hit as many as possible. But really, for example, with higher education, is to understand the demographics that are happening within that area, to understand what kind of disabilities are coming into the space, so we can gear ourselves to those exact disabilities. So we go broad, but then we have to minimize our efforts to exactly that demographic that we're serving. As I mentioned, there are very, very different types of disabilities, and that's when universal design starts talking, because the idea is to have, an equitable and inclusivity within every single part of educational environment. But how you attack these things, it depends on the demographic.
Right. So universal design, we talked a little bit about universal design, or Adam did earlier. And really for architecture, or as I view universal design, is that it creates a framework by which we can view different kinds of disabilities. So this diagram kind of defines what that framework is. At the bottom, we want to be helping the majority of people with disabilities or special needs, right? That creates the base. And really that's ADA. But what we want to do with universal design is start to expand the group of people that we can accommodate within any particular project. And that kind of moves us up the pyramid all the way to the top, where people with unique disabilities may require personal assistance or other accommodations. Unfortunately, the buildings can only be so accommodating. And it's great that here at Joliet Junior College, we have groups like yours who is able to move beyond the physical environment and start helping students in different kinds of ways with their education.
These are just some design principles for universal design. So those are things that you need to think out, that is in the back of your head whenever you're designing any kind of environment. So I'm just going to say a couple. It needs to be equitable for everybody. It needs to be easy to be understand. It needs to be very simple, and it needs to be easy to navigate. And it has to have some kind of tolerance for error. So those are just different ways of thinking in order when you're designing a building.
I wanted to talk a little bit about a group called Arrow, who is a educational, or has historically been an educational partner for K through 12 school districts in the kind of southwest suburbs of Chicago. Historically, they had spaces within other schools or within school districts that helped students with mental, physical, some behavioral disabilities. And they were kind of integrated within the school. But they felt that they could do more help or be more helpful to these students with a purpose-built facility for some of these students. So we were fortunate enough to have the opportunity to design this building for them. It's currently under construction, again, in the southwest suburbs, and it will serve, I think, 10 different districts in that area. But the real opportunity for us was to work with the administration, with the staff, with the students, in order to research how we can best serve students with these kinds of disabilities. And the design principles that we developed together were the ones kind of listed here, that we wanted to address issues around sensory loading, transitions, and I'll talk a little bit more about these, some of these in a little bit more detail, overlapping geographic stressors, biophilia, and care.
So just to give you a little snippet of what we're talking about, when we're talking about sensory loading, I'm going to talk about autism. And for example, autistic people, students, they are very triggered by color and pattern and lighting. So how do we balance those factors in a building can affect how a student is going to learn. Little things like that. Next.
Right. And then also sequencing and transitions. So the whole building was really designed around particular schedules for the students, right? And trying to avoid pathways that are more circuitous, right? Everything needs to be kind of along a linear line. Additionally, as in terms of transitions, there can be a lot of anxiety for some students around transitioning from one type of space to another. So whether that's moving from outside to inside, or from a corridor to a classroom, or from you know, even from you know, a gym area to a classroom, or a physical education environment to the classroom. So we really studied how that can be done best, and create transitional spaces. And I'll show you an example of that in a moment.
The next one is overlapping approaches. And for example, when you have some, you know, interesting or a mental disability, sometimes it's very like nervousness to get to a bigger space. For example, like a cafeteria, you might be intimidated, socially intimidated by going in there. So when you have those spaces, it's also always nice to create adjacent spaces that are a little bit more calm, that they don't have these high ceilings, that are a little bit more cozy. So people that have those disabilities, or you know, that they need a little bit more care, they go into these spaces. So they're still part of that cafeteria, but they're on their own environment. So it's thinking about what can overlap in order for everybody to have the same experience. Some geographic stressors, as Adam was talking about, I mean, it can be very, very stressful to get to the entrance of a college. So how do we think space-wise in order to bring the stress down? The same thing, going into the classroom. You're the last one coming to the classroom. It's like you kind of feel not that good. And especially if there's something mentally, or there's something happening, some kind of disability, you are probably feeling a little bit more stressed. So those places that come together is how do you minimize that trigger mentally. Biophilia. If there's a place for everybody feels well, it's in nature. And there's a lot of science behind it. There's patterns, there's colors, there's smells, there's air, there's views. When you combine all those feelings and triggers into interiors, is when your soul kind of goes in peace, your body's in peace, and you're better at learning with any kind of disability. So having those, it doesn't mean that the whole building is going to be green, but having those patterns, softer touches, makes it, it's universal design. And it's not just about students, as we were talking about, as there was a question here, it's also about the teachers. It's about who is in the building. So in order to relieve stress is to engage everybody, to have clear communication, and those are part of design elements. we talk about light, color, and pattern. If I turn the lights off right now, you're not going to see any color. So that's the connection between color and light. And again, depending on the disability that that somebody might have, those can be trigger, positive or negative triggers. So there's a vast color psychology that we go through in order to understand what to use in each space.
Right. And just to illustrate a couple of the ideas that we talked about, this is a corridor that's within the Aero School. As you can see, there's like these kind of recessed doorways that serve as a vestibule or transition space. There's actually a secondary transition space within the classroom as well. Because one of the things that we heard was that students had difficulty transitioning from the classroom to, or from the corridor, which can be relatively calm, to a classroom that is sometimes chaotic, right? So having to look from the corridor into directly into the classroom was something that we wanted to avoid. So that's why the doors are arranged in the way they are. The light is indirect within this vestibule space, and there's a kind of change in material. Additionally, the color palette that we used is very kind of earth tones and calming, not a lot of bright colors. Although what the colors did do, there was actually 4 wings within this school, and it provided a kind of wayfinding. So depending on what color wing you are in, or each wing was identified with a separate color. Additionally, the graphics for signage were very large and in a contrasting color. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, and as you can see, there's no sharp corners.
Right. No,
So, is that biophilic roundedness of space.
Right. And it allows you to kind of like move from one space to another a little bit more fluidly. And I want to end here with a project that I think really kind of embodies accessible design. This is known as the Meson Bordeaux. It was designed by an architect, Rem Koolhaas. He's a Dutch architect. It was built in Bordeaux in 1998. And it's funny because when I was first asked to be on this panel and kind of talk about a couple of things, I didn't even think about this project because it's just so canonical within the architectural kind of community that I don't even think of it as an example of accessible design, okay? But the story behind it is that it was built for a husband and wife. He is a professor in Bordeaux, and he was in a kind of terrible car accident, almost lost his life, and then was in a wheelchair after that. So he went to OMA and said, "Can you design a house for me?" Right? And there was no requirements for ADA. This was simply designed in the best way to serve this particular client. So I'll give you a couple of examples of the things that were done, and really a lot of the things that are things that we try to do in accessible design as well. So this is the bathroom, and there's a couple features that I call your attention to. One is the shower is kind of in the back. The shower head is lower. You can see that there's no transition in the floor between the main bathroom and where the shower area is. You'll also see that the countertop has nothing below it, so it allows for kind of clear wheelchair access along the entire length. And even things like the lever for the sink is kind of located on the countertop and has a long stem on that lever, so it's easy to manipulate. You look at doors, for example. Doors before 1990, really, you could have a knob, right? But you'll never see a knob anymore because a knob is very difficult to manipulate for somebody who has some dexterity difficulty with dexterity, right? There, you'll always have this kind of lever. And that also extends into the kitchen. So you can see again, two things. One is all of the cabinets are located below the countertops and accessible to anybody, right? The other thing is any of the work areas. So the sink, the cooktop, all of those have clear knee space below all of those features. And you know, if you look at a sink that's maybe in a lab space in your classroom, you'll notice that there is a recessed knee space below that sink in order to accommodate wheelchairs. That's why that's that way. And if you'll look here, I'm going to point to it here. There's this little platform, and this is probably the most unique feature of this house, which is this elevator that extends through the 3 floors of the house. So at the top, there's the bedrooms. The middle floor is the living space, and the lower floor is the kitchen. And what's really nicely done about this is that it's not an elevator that's in a corner. You know, Sylvia said this, and it's not even an elevator that's in a box. It's an elevator that becomes a space within the house. This is actually was designed as his office, right? So he's got a workspace, and then the elevator itself travels along a bookshelf on one side. So, and some of the other things you might want to pay attention to is if you look at the transition between inside and outside, there's no level change. And in fact, there's no threshold either, right? So there's no difference between the level of the outside and the level of the inside. And that's something that we're always kind of trying to achieve and be thinking about, right? Is what do those level changes look like? That's the end of my presentation. If anybody has any questions.
Oh, that's nice. Oh, that was for me.
You never know, the future
I could
might bring it.
I could live there too. Yeah.
Yes.
My question is for our young architects in the room. Is this something that one person in an office will specialize in? Or is this something that all students will need to know, you know, regardless of where their position is within a firm?
I think because of how pervasive the ADA requirements are, everybody needs to be familiar with ADA if you're going to be a practicing architect, okay? In some ways, it depends on what kind of work you're going to do. If you're going to be doing strictly single-family houses, the ADA doesn't extend to that kind of work. But that being said, there's certainly a space and typically a position within any small or maybe even large office where there's a specialist in the ADA requirements. And if that's something that you're interested in as an architect, I think any firm would be happy to have that kind of specialist because as others have said here, those requirements are constantly changing. They're not always black and white. And so having somebody that has the experience and the deeper knowledge to understand and interpret the ADA, if you have any questions, is very important.
Just take note, if you ever need a guinea pig for a wheelchair, call me.
Sure, awesome. Yeah, and you know, I think it's really important, and it's nice that you're having this conference. But if you are, if you know, JJC or any other institution that you're involved in is embarking on a architectural project, I would encourage you to kind of get involved in that process. And I'm sure any architect would be happy to hear what you have to say and try to broaden the scope of accessibility in any project.
One thing I want to mention too is as designers, you need to put yourselves in the shoes of the disability. So, I mean, I'm going to go back to you. It's one of the things that happened when I was going into school is they asked us to walk the school, well, to wheelchair ourselves through the school, through my university, to see what worked and what didn't work. So we actually had to do that, and it was the same. You have to go into, visual disability, into hearing disability, put your mind into it, so you can actually think about it for the rest of your life as a designer.
I just want to make one comment on something you guys talked about earlier that I think is really good for the young architects here to think about. I had the unique experience of working at Roosevelt University downtown, and it's a really, really interesting space because they have a brand new building that was built in like 2010 that connects to a really famous building, the auditorium in Chicago, which is made by, I think, Adler was the architect of that. Mm-hmm. And it was in the late 1800s. And it's one school in this like brand spanking new building and this really old one. And it created so many hardships because there were things that I could advocate and say, you have to do this in this building. And then I say, well, we need this in this building. They're like, well, the law. And it made a lot of difficulties for an office like ours because we still have to come up with a solution. So that might mean I need to move a meeting from the old building to the new building. Just little things like that. And looking at older spaces and coming up with solutions that are cost efficient is going to be important to the institution that makes the decision. Because obviously, if it's up to me, I'll knock down any wall that I want to. If I could, if it was up to me, I'm like, knock it down, let's fix it. But I get there's a lot of cost. There's even things that you have to think about within the physical structure that removing a wall may not be realistic for what that is supporting, right? And so I think it's a really unique obstacle for young architects to think about. And I would use the Roosevelt University buildings as just a great visual feature of like how you can see those juxtaposed against each other.
Mm. And I think I'd just like to add, it's not just for architects and designers, but for all of us to be able to kind of think differently when we enter spaces. And Esley has been an amazing student advocate for all students here. And for us, hearing the student voice is so important. Mm-hmm. So as a student, if you find a place that's hard to navigate or, accessing the vending machines or whatever it is that you see, bring that to someone's attention, because even if it doesn't impact you as an individual, it can help us to proactively help it for someone else. So those of you who are young architects, young designers, thinking from a different lens. I loved the slide you had, Adam, of the straight line versus the curvy crazy line. I think 10 years ago, 15, 20 years ago, it was all about that visual intricacy. And you didn't think about how that might impact a variety of individuals. Someone with anxiety, someone in a wheelchair, someone with crutches, someone with a visual impairment. All of those things, if we think about it from the way to make it accessible to as many as possible, we're going to deeply simplify what we do. And think about your homes. What do your homes say? I have a best friend who has a child who's in a wheelchair, and it really made me look at my home differently, because was Sammy able to access certain areas of my home? And so I think if we think about everything through that lens, we can be powerful advocates for each other. And that's kind of my challenge to everyone.
Thank you. I want to thank everybody for being here. There was a term that you used earlier that I asked for some comment on, and that's reasonable accommodation. So whether it's from the legal standpoint, the design standpoint, but if anybody would like to comment, I think that would really benefit, because we hear that term all the time in terms of reasonable accommodations. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to talk about it in the physical space, because I think one thing that's, undue burden is a concept that we hear about a lot under ADA law, that if we're going to apply accommodation, if it is going to create an undue burden on the institution, so a huge financial ask, it's going to cost, $500,000 to reconfigure this whole room. The institution can say, all right, we're due to undue burden, like we cannot meet this requirement. But what a great term, undue burden. And, I've been seeing from an academic standpoint, I've been seeing undue burden not winning in court as often as it used to from an academic standpoint. I don't know what that looks like on a physical facility standpoint, because some of those costs can be really high, but undue burden, and then what's the other? The reasonable accommodation. Like, we also have to make sure that we're upholding the integrity of the classroom when it comes to an accommodation. So for example, if a class is taking a 50 multiple choice question test, in K through 12, some students may only have to take 25 questions and only have 3 multiple choice selections instead of 4. I can't do that in college because I would be changing the learning benchmarks that individuals who are being trained in certain areas need to meet. So those are sort of the 2 standards that we sort of function by when looking at requests that maybe do not have that black and white DOJ case on. But I'll let them talk a little bit more about undue burden in physical spaces, because it's just a tough one, undue burden.
I'm going to touch one more thing with reasonable accommodation. And very often we'll have an individual ask for a specific accommodation, and that may or may not be considered reasonable if it impacts that, like Adam said, that standard, especially in programs that have certification exams. Or, may have, I'm thinking nursing, I'm thinking EMS, I'm thinking fire science. Like, there are some things that we are not able to do the full level of a requested accommodation, but we have that conversation about what can we do. And so we always try to find what we can do that works for keeping the integrity of the class, as well as, and attendance is another one for that as well. So lots with the learning, it's a very gray area. Adam and I are finishing each other's sentences up here because we talk constantly before we make a decision to make sure that we're looking at every possible option to help the student to have equitable access as much as possible. So if you ever have a question, come see Adam.
Got another question here So being architects, what you mentioned how you can't accommodate everyone all at once. What boxes do you check first?
That's a fantastic question. I think the ones, am I here? Yeah. The ones that you check first are the baselines, obviously ADA. So everything that is mobility, those are, because that's, that's worldwide. After that, you really go into visual and hearing because they are physical. Everything that is physical, you go first. Then what you go is you go into whatever is brain. So everything that is mental, everything that is behavioral. So that's kind of like the list that you go through. But what I will really emphasize is, I mentioned before, is it all depends on demographics. And our job is, I don't know if you know what is master planning, but literally when you start building a building, you need to understand the big overall of a college, for example, to do that master plan. And our job will be to literally talk to them in order to understand what are the disabilities that are happening in this college, in Joliet College, in order for us to understand that the highest disabilities are visual, or their hearing, or is mobility, and literally attack those. In order to create a space that is good for all, it's kind of interesting because, depending on the function of the space and depending on the disability, it's just a balancing act. It's really a balancing act.
And can I just add something? Because I think just to take this full circle, we are still learning so much more about disability. We still have a society that's very uninformed. And we have a lot of work to do to learn more, to be better. Like, the same way that there's no such thing as the perfect building at this moment in time. There's no perfect set of accommodations I'm going to give you from our classroom, but I know them just as much as me that we're going to strive for that and we're going to work towards it. And that's why things like this are extremely important, that we continue to have this dialogue, that we continue to open conversations, because we have a society have a long way to go, I think, to really meeting with people with disabilities with where they're at.
Great question.
Thank you, Adam and Sylvia, for the amazing presentation, and everyone who answered the questions. And thank you for the questions too. Does anyone have any last questions at all? just like the beginning, we would like to please like you to answer a few questions on the polls. In the polls are the reflection of this event. Put a thumbs up, a thumbs in the middle, or a thumbs down based on these questions. The first question is, do you feel you have a better understanding of the terms disability and accessibility?
Well, that's good to see.
Very good. Second question, now how familiar are you with the American Disability Act? Very good. I'm glad everyone got a better understanding of it. And for the third question, how familiar are you with the application of ADA in architecture? Very good. If anyone needs, we can hopefully incite some more information. And with one or two words, what was your biggest takeaway from this event and what have you guys learned?
Flexibility.
Flexibility.
Universal design.
Partnership.
Those are all-
Together in one big family.
That's true, and that's very actually those are all really good words because all those, especially people with disability, we all need to understand that what we build is for everyone, and everyone needs to feel comfortable and be comfortable in the area that they're in. So, thank you for everyone that works, especially with ADA and an architecture to build and create a better building and world for everyone.
We have met today to raise awareness, to be informed about disability, ADA, and how the two come to meet together in architecture. Architecture is beyond just making buildings. It's a way to design for life. And for people, most importantly, it's a way to create experiences that every person can enjoy.
The importance of this event is to bring an awareness about people with disabilities and how we should know and understand how the built environment should be built for anyone with a disability. It's not about making them included by doing the minimum for them, but doing the most by making them feel a part of the community and to be comfortable with themselves in any place.
Would the speakers like to add anything about the importance of combining disability awareness and architecture?
Actually, I would. One of the things that we're doing this year is kind of doing like a proactive internal self-assessment of civil rights. And so one of the pieces of that, using a state tool, is to do a facility walkthrough. And I have an amazing team. We have people from our facilities. We have Professor Rafak. We have Adam. We have somebody from purchasing. And so it has been just such an eye-opening experience for us to walk through classrooms. You know, I sit in my office a lot. I don't always get into classrooms. And to see small things that we can fix very easy, as well as big things, how can we serve our students better? One thing I'm very excited to see, I haven't done main campus yet, but at Romeoville, every single handicap accessible parking spot is a van spot, which is a larger spot. That's not required, but it's above and beyond. And it's one of the many things that JJC has done. And so again, asking you, if you see something that you're not sure, please reach out and tell somebody so we can address it. But we're trying to be proactive, to look at the way our campuses are designed, to look at the way they function for our students, to make it better for all. So I just thank you all for being here today. I think this is wonderful. I'm glad to be a part of it.
Thank you for adding on. And if everybody would like to give a great round of applause for our speakers today.
Just as a reminder, our next event will be on Wednesday, April 20th from 1 to 30 p.m. in the same location. It will be a question and answer panel with the students sharing their experience and perspective with ADA and architecture.
All right. I would once again like to thank our 5 specialists today. Thank everybody who came into the room, and of course, everybody who was online, and our excellent behind the scenes team, Aaron and Jake and our camera folks, along with our interpreter that make our events happen. Thank you all for coming, and I look forward to seeing all of you again on April 20th. Thank you.